The morning Dr. Selin Selic arrived at Site Zero, the grass had grown back. This was the detail that would haunt her for the rest of her career, not the object itself, not the readings that would make the laws of physics seem like rough drafts, not even the moment she understood what it meant for everything she had ever believed about cause and effect. It was the grass. 3 days earlier, the excavation team had torn up 17 acres of high-altitude meadow in the Karakoram Range, churning the thin soil into rust-colored mud. She had seen the satellite imagery herself, a wound in the mountain's flank, brown and raw under the pale October sky. But when she stepped out of the helicopter onto the ridge above the site, the meadow was green. Seamlessly, uniformly green. The kind of green that takes a season to establish. She stood there a moment too long. The rotors were still spinning, and the wind pressed her jacket flat against her ribs, and Dr. Yusuf Beg, her department head, was already walking toward the prefabricated research compound at the meadow's edge. He didn't seem to notice the grass. Nobody seemed to notice the grass. She pulled out her phone and opened the satellite image again. Brown. She looked up. Green. She took a photograph and put her phone away and told herself there were explanations. Altitude could distort perception. She had been traveling for 22 hours. She had not slept. She was very good at telling herself things. The object was in a chamber 40 meters below the meadow. It had been found by a geological survey drone cataloging potential mining sites, one of those algorithmic strokes of accidental discovery that science depends on and never likes to admit. The drone's ground-penetrating radar had returned an anomalous reading, a void in the granite, perfectly sealed, and inside the void, a shape. The shape was not geological. The shape had edges. The excavation team had spent 9 days cutting through the rock. They'd used precision laser cutters to preserve the structural integrity of whatever chamber existed below, working in 12-hour shifts, eating and sleeping in pressurized tents because the altitude at this latitude was not generous. When they finally opened the chamber, the project lead, a Swiss engineer named Hartmann, had simply stopped talking for 4 minutes. The recording was in the briefing file Selin had read on the plane. She had listened to that 4-minute silence 3 times. Now she descended into the earth. The access shaft was reinforced concrete, poured in the days since the opening. Bright LED strips lit the walls with a slightly green-tinted light that she suspected was accidental. The temperature dropped steadily. By the time she reached the chamber's antechamber, a pressurized airlock that the team had engineered around the opening, it was 4 degrees Celsius, and her breath was coming in small visible clouds. Hartmann was waiting. He was a compact, precise man with the habit of holding his hands loosely at his sides when he was trying to appear calm. His hands were very loose right now. 42 hours since we last measured it, he said, without greeting her. No change in temperature. No change in the emission profile. No detectable decay of any measurable isotope. You said in the report the surface reads as older than the surrounding rock. Older than the surrounding rock by approximately 400 million years. Yes. And the rock formation dates to 80 million years. Give or take. He looked at her steadily. The object is older than the cavity it sits in. She absorbed this. That's not. No, he agreed. It's not. He opened the inner door. The chamber was roughly oval, about the size of a tennis court, with walls of natural granite that had been cut away cleanly at the perimeter. The cuts were not the excavation team's work. The cuts were ancient, smooth and slightly luminescent, as if the rock itself had been convinced to part rather than forced. Standing lights had been positioned around the perimeter, and they lit the object from below and from the sides, and the object did not particularly care. It was 3 meters tall and 2 meters wide at its broadest point, which was roughly a third of the way up from its base. The shape was not quite any shape that existed in ordinary taxonomy. It was not a sphere or a cylinder or a polyhedron. It had curves that resolved into planes and planes that resolved into curves, and the relationship between these elements changed depending on where you stood. From the door where Selin stood, it looked almost like a teardrop leaning slightly to the left. When she took 12 steps to the right, it looked like something else entirely, a shape she didn't have a word for, something that felt grammatically wrong, like a sentence in which the verb has been placed in an impossible tense. Its surface was dark. Not black, dark. There was a distinction that took her a moment to process. Black is the absence of reflected light. This was something that seemed to absorb the concept of reflection and replace it with something quieter. The standing lights gave off no glare on its surface. She could see the lights in the chamber. She could see Hartmann beside her. She could not see herself in the object's surface, though she was standing 3 meters away and it was 3 meters tall. It has no reflection, she said. It has no reflection that corresponds to the present moment, Hartmann corrected carefully. At 0300 this morning, Dr. Okonkwo was working alone in here. She reports seeing a reflection. She photographed it. He handed Selin his tablet. The photograph showed the object's surface clearly, and in the surface, barely visible, the dim shape of a person. But the person was not Dr. Okonkwo. The figure was too tall, wearing different clothes, standing at a different angle than Dr. Okonkwo's position at the time of the photograph. Who is that? Selin asked. We don't know, Hartmann said. We've run it against every member of the excavation and research team. No match. Selin looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at the object. The object did not look back. It simply occupied its space with a patience that felt geological, or more than geological. A patience that felt like it predated patience as a concept. I want to start the full materials analysis today, she said. Of course, said Hartmann. Though I should tell you, the last team that tried a direct contact scan. I read the report. Then you know that Dr. Ferreira's instruments reset. All of them. Simultaneously. I know. And that his laptop, which was not running any measurement software and was simply open to a word processing document, contained 17 pages of text when he'd written none. Hartmann nodded. He doesn't know what the text says. It's not in any language he recognizes. We've been running it through every linguistic database we have access to. And it doesn't match any human language, living or extinct. But our computational linguist, Dr. Park, says it has syntax. It has grammar. Something is making decisions about how to put it together. It's not random. It's not noise. He paused. She says it reads, in some structural sense she can't fully articulate, like instructions. The object stood in its impossible patience and said nothing. Selin reached into her bag and took out her own instruments and got to work. The first 3 weeks were the weeks of confirmation. This was what Selin privately called them, the weeks of establishing what was real before grappling with what it meant. She was a physicist by training and a cosmologist by practice, and she had built her career on the principle that the universe is internally consistent. That it has rules. That the rules, however counterintuitive, however hostile to human intuition, hold. She had studied the interior of black holes in the mathematical sense. She had worked with the team that confirmed the existence of a new class of dark matter interaction. She believed, profoundly and structurally, that strangeness was not a sign of impossibility. Strangeness was a sign of inadequate framework. Find the right framework, and the strangeness resolves. She was working very hard to keep believing this. The object's age was confirmed by 4 independent methods. The first was radiometric analysis of the surface material, which registered isotopic ratios that placed it firmly in the Cambrian period, 500 million years ago, and then, when they refined the analysis, substantially further back. The second was cosmological. The object's surface contained trace quantities of isotopes that exist only as byproducts of specific stellar events, the collapse of a particular type of massive star that had been common in the early universe and was now rare. The stars that could have produced these isotopes had burned out 4 to 5 billion years before the first multicellular life appeared on Earth. The third method was structural. The crystalline arrangement of the object's surface material had undergone a process of quantum-level ordering that required a minimum of 3 billion years to achieve under any known physical conditions. The fourth method was the one that kept Selin awake. The fourth method was theoretical, suggested by Dr. Park working across disciplines in a way that was becoming characteristic of how this object drove people beyond their fields. She pointed out that the object's surface emitted a very faint signal, not radio, not electromagnetic in any conventional sense, but a pattern of quantum state fluctuations that carried information. And the information it carried was, as best they could decode it, a record of its own past. Not a transmission. A record embedded in its structure, the way a tree carries its age in its rings. And the record went back to a point in time that preceded the formation of the solar system. The object was older than the Earth. It had been here, in this specific location in what would eventually become the Karakoram Range, for longer than the planet it was buried in had existed. Which was, of course, not possible. But there it Saturday. If I had to summarize the problem, Dr. Park said one evening, standing at the whiteboard in the main analysis room, surrounded by printouts and half-empty coffee cups and the particular exhausted energy of a group of brilliant people encountering something that is actively defeating them, the problem is that the object exists at a point in space-time that is causally disconnected from everything we can identify as its origin. Everything has an origin. Even the universe has an origin, or at least a boundary condition that functions as one. This object has no detectable origin. It simply exists, fully formed, in a past that has no record of anything producing it. Something produced it, said Dr. Ferreira. He was a materials scientist, a careful man who had been quietly shaken by the incident with his laptop and had responded by becoming more careful still. Yes, Park said. Something must have. That's what makes it interesting. She didn't say terrifying. She said interesting. This was one of the things Selin admired about her. What if the origin is not in our past, said Okonkwo. She was the team's astrophysicist, a Nigerian-British woman who had the habit of asking the questions everyone was avoiding. What if the origin is in our future? The room was quiet for a moment. Then we have a causality problem, Ferreira said. We already have a causality problem, Okonkwo said. I'm suggesting we name it accurately. This was the night that the idea entered the room and didn't leave. Not as a conclusion. They were scientists. They didn't leap to conclusions. They noted the hypothesis and assigned it a probability and continued gathering data. But the idea was there now, that the object had not come from the past. That it had come from the future and arrived in the past. That it had arrived in a time before the civilization that could have created it existed. The idea sat in the room like the object sat in the chamber, patient, without reflection, waiting. It was Selin who first noticed that the photographs didn't agree with each other. She had assembled a visual record of the object, thousands of photographs taken from dozens of angles over the 3 weeks since her arrival. She was building a three-dimensional model, trying to formalize the shape, to give it a name, even a functional one, the way you give a name to a class of mathematical object even when the name is purely technical. She had noticed, working with the photographs, that the shape seemed different depending on the angle. She had assumed this was an optical effect, some property of the surface that manipulated light in unusual ways. But when she began cross-referencing photographs taken from the same angle at different times, she found something that was not an optical effect. The shape was different. Not dramatically. Not in ways that would announce themselves unless you were doing precisely this kind of detailed comparative analysis. But the curve at the upper left portion of the object, the region she had begun calling the shoulder, privately, was measurably different in photographs taken 3 days apart. The photographs had GPS metadata. The camera positions matched to within half a centimeter. The lighting setup was documented and consistent. The difference in the shoulder curve was approximately 2 centimeters and was not attributable to measurement error. She spent an entire night doing this work alone, before she told anyone. She pulled every photograph with documented position data and built a timeline. What she found was not a consistent change, not the object growing or shrinking in one direction, which might have suggested some kind of mechanical process. What she found was that the shape was varying. Slightly, within a narrow range, but definitely varying. It was as if the object's form was not fixed. As if it existed in some kind of flux that was very slow, or that only partially expressed itself in physical space. She stared at the analysis until it became obvious, and then she sat for a while in the silence of the main analysis room at 3 a.m, listening to the ventilation system and the faint sound of wind through the shaft above, and she thought about what it means for an object to have a shape. A shape is a boundary. A boundary is a distinction between what the object is and what it is not. A shape, she thought, is a claim. I exist here and not there. The object seemed to be making this claim in a way that was slightly, carefully, persistently uncertain. As if it was not fully committed to being in one place. As if it was, in some sense she didn't have the mathematics for yet, slightly spread across time. She documented everything and went to sleep. In the morning, 3 of her photographs were different. She had not touched them. They were stored on an air-gapped server. The object in 3 of the photographs showed details, surface features, a faint geometric pattern in the material, that had not been visible when the photographs were taken and were not present in the adjacent photographs from the same session. The geometric pattern looked like it might be the same as the text on Ferreira's laptop. Dr. Amora Park had made a career of standing at the edge of disciplines and looking in both directions. She was a computational linguist whose doctoral thesis had been about the mathematical structure of extinct languages, how grammar preserved patterns of thought, how syntax was a kind of fossilized cognition. She had spent a decade working with AI systems on the problem of language generation, and then she had made a lateral move into what she called signal archaeology, the study of patterns in natural phenomena that might carry encoded information, not deliberately, but as a structural property of complexity. The object had called to her like a gravitational event. The text from Ferreira's laptop had 47 pages by the time Selin brought her the photographs. It was continuing to appear, new pages materializing in the document at irregular intervals, as if being transmitted in pieces. Ferreira had stopped working in the chamber, but the transmission continued anyway. The document was now on the air-gapped server. New pages were still appearing on the air-gapped server. Nobody said what this implied. They noted it in the log. Park's analysis of the text had reached what she called a first approximation. The language was not human, but it used structures that human language also used, a sign, she argued, not of human origin, but of the fact that certain grammatical structures are mathematically inevitable for any sufficiently complex communication system. You evolve toward them the way evolution converges on the eye. The text used what she identified as nested conditional structures. If this, then only if that, then possibly this other thing, depending on what has already been true. It used something that functioned like tense, markers that indicated the relationship between a described event and some reference point in time, but the tense system was more complex than any human language. Human tense systems typically distinguish between past, present, and future relative to the moment of speaking. This language had tense markers that seemed to distinguish between events based on their causal relationships, not their temporal position. Not when something happened, but whether its happening caused other happenings, and in what direction the causal force flowed. This was the breakthrough that changed everything. It doesn't have past, present, and future, Park told the team, gathered in the analysis room. It has caused, causing, and will have caused. The reference point is not now. The reference point is the causal event itself. Every verb in this language is marked relative to its position in a causal chain, not in a timeline. So they don't think about time as a line, Okonkwo said. They may not experience time as a line. Or they may understand something about time structure that makes the linear model inadequate. Park set down her notes. There's more. I've been able to decode, partially, tentatively, with a lot of assumptions I'm not happy about, some of the content. Not the meaning. Just the shape. What the text seems to be doing. She paused, and in the pause Selin felt the room lean forward slightly. It's a record, Park said. Of us. Silence. Of this, she clarified. Of this project. These 3 weeks. The questions we've been asking. The analysis we've been running. The photographs. The readings. The conversations. She looked around the room. The text that appeared after we arrived has been, as far as I can determine, with extreme uncertainty, describing our investigation of the object. That's not possible, Ferreira said, quietly. I know, Park said. But the document began appearing before we had the equipment to read it. And what it describes, structurally, in the portions I can parse, matches the sequence of our own work. In order. It's a chronicle. Of something that hadn't happened yet when it was written. Another silence. Longer this time. Unless, Selin said, and stopped. Unless it was written later, she was thinking. Unless the record was written after. Unless what appeared to be a prediction was actually a report, authored at a point when all of this had already happened, and transmitted backward to a time before it began. Unless the text was not prophecy but history, sent in the wrong direction. Unless time was not the problem. Unless causality was. She didn't say any of this yet. She was still working out what it would mean. The shifts accelerated in the 4th week. That was how Selin thought of them, shifts. The grass had been the first one, the one she had almost successfully explained away. After the grass came smaller things, easy to dismiss, a coffee mug that appeared in the break room that none of the 12 team members claimed, a notation in the shared data log that used a shorthand term Selin had invented the day after the notation appeared, a conversation that 3 team members independently recalled having with each other, in which certain conclusions were reached, but which 2 of the 3 had no memory of. These were the kinds of things that flourish in isolated, sleep-deprived, high-stakes research environments. The mind under stress is a creative interpreter of ambiguous evidence. Then came the larger ones. Selin's field notebook, a physical notebook, spiral-bound, the kind she had carried since graduate school, contained 12 pages of notes she had not written. The handwriting was hers. The notes described analyses she had not yet performed, experiments she had been thinking about but had not begun, conclusions she had tentatively reached in the privacy of her own mind but had not committed to paper. The notes were dated. The dates were 4 to 6 weeks in the future. She did not tell anyone about the notebook for 5 days. This was not scientific practice. She knew it wasn't. She documented everything in the notebook itself, including her documentation, and tried to be honest with herself about why she was waiting. The reason, she decided, was that she needed to see whether the notes would prove accurate before she shared them. If they were inaccurate, if she performed the described experiments and they yielded different results, then the notebook was anomalous but explicable. Hallucination, forgery, some failure of memory. If they were accurate, she would need to think carefully about what she was sharing and with whom. She ran the first described experiment on a Wednesday. The results matched the notebook's record exactly. She ran the second on Thursday. Exact match. On Friday she sat in the chamber alone for 4 hours. She sat at what she estimated was the optimal observational distance, close enough to take readings, far enough that the object's apparent shape was consistent from her position. She had her instruments and her altered notebook and, for the first time since arriving, a feeling she identified reluctantly as fear. Not the productive fear of a researcher who has found something that might overturn existing models. The deeper fear of someone who has found something that might overturn the model of the self, the assumption that she was a coherent entity moving in one direction through time, making choices, generating consequences. The object sat in front of her in its patient dark and she felt, for the first time, that it was aware of her. Not in any mystical sense. She was a physicist and she was precise about her language even internally. The object was not conscious, or if it was, she had no evidence for it. But it was oriented toward her in some structural sense she couldn't formalize. The way a mirror is oriented toward whatever stands in front of it, not through intention but through design. She thought, "What are you for?" The thought felt naive. But she held on to it, because the naive question is sometimes the one that opens things up. What was the object for? Everything that was engineered, and this was engineered, they were all certain of that now. This was not a natural formation, this was a made thing, had a purpose. It had been designed to do something. Designed by something. By someone. She thought about Park's analysis of the tense system. Caused, causing, will have caused. A language built not around time but around the direction of causality. A civilization that thought in terms of causal chains rather than timelines. She thought about the fact that the object was older than the Earth. She thought about the text that described their investigation before it happened. She thought about her notebook. And then, sitting alone in the chamber at 6 p.m. on a Friday in October, at 4,800 meters altitude in the Karakoram range, Dr. Selin Selick understood. She didn't have the complete mathematics. She didn't have the language. She had the shape of it, the conceptual architecture, and she knew that the mathematics would follow because mathematics always followed when the concept was clear. The concept was the hard part. The equations were just the concept made rigorous. The object had not been sent from the future to the past. It had not been sent at all, in any conventional sense. The object existed at a specific point in what she was beginning to think of as causal space, not physical space, not space-time, but the space of causal relationships. It occupied a node in a network of causes and effects, and that node had a particular property: it was self-sustaining. The object was discovered in the past because it was sent from the future, and it was sent from the future because it was discovered in the past, and neither of these events was the first one. There was no first one. The loop was closed. It had always been closed. It would always be closed. The concepts of always and never and first were framework errors, like asking what is north of the North Pole. The object existed because they would study it, and they would study it because it existed, and these two facts were the same fact, described from different positions in the loop. It was an artifact of a civilization that had learned to do what the language suggested they thought about, to reason and act in terms of causal structure rather than temporal sequence. They had not traveled in time. They had understood that time was a way of narrating causality, not the other way around. And they had made something that existed entirely in the causal dimension, an object whose presence was self-sustaining because it was the cause of the conditions that produced it, which were the conditions that discovered it, which were the conditions that led to its creation. The loop had no input from outside. It was energetically closed. It was logically closed. It was, in a sense that she was only beginning to appreciate, complete. She sat with this for a long time. Then she picked up her notebook and wrote, "It was not sent to us. It was always here. We made it by finding it. We found it because we will make it." The object is the record of a causal event that has no beginning and no end. It is the universe leaving itself a note, and the note is the reason the note exists. She read this back. Then she wrote, "I'm afraid this is correct." The full team meeting was the hardest thing she had ever done professionally. Harder than her doctoral defense, which had covered genuinely difficult territory in quantum cosmology and had been examined by people who had made careers of finding weakness. Harder than the year she spent trying to publish the dark matter paper through reviewers who were convinced she had made an error that didn't exist. Harder than those things because those things had been difficult within the existing framework. This was the framework itself. She walked them through it methodically. The age data. The causal language. The text that documented their work before they did it. Her notebook. The varying shape of the object, which she now proposed was not the object changing but the object being perceived across its temporal extension. They were seeing it from multiple points in the loop simultaneously, the way you might see multiple positions of a spinning object if you could see in 4 dimensions. The reflection Okonkwo had photographed, a person who was not on the current team, wearing clothing that was slightly different from anything currently in use, possibly a member of the future team that would eventually construct and send the object, photographed in the object surface because the object surface was not a mirror reflecting the present. It was a surface that expressed the whole loop at once. She watched their faces as she spoke. She was watching for the thing that happens sometimes in scientific discourse when an idea was wrong, a specific kind of skeptical stillness, the look of a mind generating refutations. She saw that stillness in Ferreira's face for the first 20 minutes, and then she saw it slowly change. She saw the moment it changed in Hartmann, and in Okonkwo, and in each of the others. The moment when the machinery of objection found nothing to object to, when the weight of the evidence and the internal logic of the framework made the refutations collapse before they formed. She had never watched a room of scientists accept an impossible thing in real time before. It was both more and less dramatic than she would have expected. It was quiet. It was the sound of 7 brilliant people arriving, from different directions, at the same conclusion. The object is self-caused, Park said finally. Yes. It exists because it was found, and it was found because it exists. And because it will be built. By us, or by something that follows us, or by something that our work will lead to. How far in the future? Okonkwo asked. Selin shook her head. The loop might close in 1,000 years. It might close in 1,000,000. The mathematics allows for any duration. Duration is a property of the time narrative we impose on the causal structure. The causal structure itself is atemporal. It's just a circuit. Permanently closed. Then we're part of it, Hartmann said. This conversation. This project. Yes. And everything we publish. Everything we derive from the object. Every technology that grows out of what we learn here. Yes. We're not discovering the object, Ferreira said slowly. We're completing it. Selin thought about the grass growing back. She thought about the notebook. She thought about the mysterious figure in Okonkwo's photograph, standing in the object's non-reflective surface wearing slightly unfamiliar clothes, looking at something just out of frame. We were always completing it, she said. She published the paper 8 months later. It was 47 pages, which she recognized with a specific and uncanny feeling when she counted, because 47 was the number of pages the text from Ferreira's laptop had reached before it stopped arriving. The paper laid out the theoretical framework she had begun constructing that Friday evening in the chamber and had refined through months of work with Park and Okonkwo and 3 additional specialists brought in under extreme secrecy. It described what she called closed causal structures, self-sustaining loops in causal space that required no external input, that were energetically and logically complete. It described the object as the first confirmed example of such a structure. It described the implications for physics, for cosmology, for the philosophy of time. It did not describe what she had begun to suspect in the final weeks of the on-site research period, which was that the object was not unique. That the object was not a message from a more advanced civilization, exactly, but a demonstration. That its existence was designed, if designed was even a meaningful word for something with no beginning, not to give them technology or information, but to give them the concept. The concept of closed causal structure. The concept of acting in causal space rather than temporal sequence. Because once you had the concept, the next question was obvious. She had been avoiding the next question for 3 months. She had a particular mental discipline that she had developed over 20 years of research, a kind of deliberate narrowing, an ability to focus on the problem in front of her and set aside the implications until she had the foundation solid. She had used this discipline to finish the paper. She had used it to survive the peer review process, which had been extraordinary in ways she was not at liberty to discuss. She had used it to give the press conference and the Senate briefing and the address to the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics, in which she had explained what they had found in language careful enough to be accurate and accessible enough to land. She had used it to not think about the next question. On the night the paper published, she sat alone in her office in Istanbul with a glass of water and the lights off and let herself think it. The next question was, if a sufficiently advanced understanding of causal structure allows you to create a closed causal loop, what do you put in it? The object contained technology. It contained information. It contained a language. It contained what appeared to be instructions. They had spent 8 months decoding those instructions, and the decoding was unfinished, but the portion they had decoded pointed toward specific physical processes, specific arrangements of matter and energy, specific techniques for manipulating quantum states in ways that current technology could not achieve but that current theory could not rule out. Instructions for building something. She had known for a month what the instructions were for. She had told no one. She was not sure she would tell anyone soon. She was sitting with it, the way she had sat with the framework itself in the chamber at altitude, holding it up against the light and looking at it from every angle, checking for the thing that would make it wrong. The instructions were for building the object. Not an object like it. The object. The specific object, currently housed in its reinforced chamber 40 meters below a mountain meadow in the Karakoram range. The instructions described dimensions, material compositions, quantum-level structural arrangements, processes for achieving the surface property that made the object's age measurements return the values they returned, that made it appear, to any investigative method available in the 21st century or likely available for centuries afterward, to have existed for 5 billion years. The instructions described how to create something that had always existed. How to make something that was already here. How to finish closing the loop. She had known this for a month and she had felt, during that month, a sequence of responses she was still cataloguing. First, disbelief, the productive kind. Then the systematic dismantling of the disbelief by the logic of the framework she herself had built. Then something she could only describe as vertigo, not physical, but conceptual. The vertigo of looking at a chain of causation and finding no first link. The vertigo of understanding that she was not at the beginning or the end of something, but in the middle of something that had no beginning or end. And then, slowly, something else. Not acceptance, that was too passive a word for what she felt. Something more like recognition. The feeling of encountering a proof that is not what you expected but is, when you have followed it to its conclusion, undeniably true. The feeling of a framework settling into place. The object was here because someone would build it. Someone would build it because they had found it. They had found it because the instructions it contained led to its construction. The instructions it contained were decoded because they found it. They found it because, this was the part that still made her breath catch, because they were always going to find it. There was a version of this that was terrifying, the version in which free will was an illusion, in which the loop was a trap, in which the future was already determined because the object had always been here, encoding the instructions that would close the loop that made it always be here. She had spent considerable time with that version, because she was rigorous and she did not avoid uncomfortable implications. But there was another version. The version she had come to sit with more comfortably, though she would never call it comfortable, that was too gentle a word. The version that felt, not comforting, but adequate. The version in which the closed causal loop was not a trap but a shape. The universe had, somehow, evolved a structure that sustained itself across time by virtue of its own internal logic. The object existed because a civilization would arise that was sophisticated enough to understand causal structure, and that civilization would arise because the object existed to be found and studied and learned from, and this was not a trap or a paradox. It was more like, she reached for the analogy carefully, it was more like the way a living organism sustains itself. Not trapped in its own metabolism. Made of it. The loop was not a cage. It was a form of life. She sat with this in the dark. The water in her glass was room temperature. Outside the window, Istanbul moved through its nighttime self, taxis and ferries and the lit windows of 10 million people engaged in the ordinary miracle of existing without knowing why, which was of course the universal condition and had been since the first creatures capable of wandering arose on this small planet and looked up. She thought about the grass. Growing back as if nothing had happened. As if the wound in the mountain was already healed before it was made. She picked up her pen. She had a second paper to write. The paper that would describe the instructions. The paper that would begin the conversation, across whatever timespan it required, about whether to build the object. How to build the object. When to begin. Though of course when to begin was the wrong question. The wrong framework. She crossed it out mentally before she'd finished thinking it. The right question was, where in the loop do we enter? And the answer that was already true, had always been true, would always be true, from every direction simultaneously, was, here. She began to write. Months passed. Seasons. The paper published and created the kind of reaction that genuine ruptures create, not the clean drama of acceptance or rejection but the long, difficult, generative friction of a field in the process of being rebuilt from the inside. Selin gave lectures and answered questions and wrote responses to responses. She watched other researchers take the framework and run with it in directions she hadn't anticipated. There were papers within 18 months about closed causal structures in biology, in quantum mechanics, in the history of mathematics itself. There was a philosopher, a young man from Montevideo named Esperanza, who published a book arguing that human consciousness was itself a closed causal structure, that selfhood was not a thing but a loop, a self-sustaining pattern of cause and effect that had no more need of an external origin than the object did. She found this book persuasive and slightly vertiginous and quoted it in a footnote. The decoding of the object's instructions continued. The team had expanded. There were now 4 to 7 researchers, she had noted this number without surprise, working across 6 countries under an international agreement that had been negotiated with an unusual degree of speed, given what governments are. The instructions were detailed and comprehensive and described processes that current technology could not achieve. Which meant, could not achieve yet. This was the practical shape of the loop. You find the object. You decode the instructions. You develop the technology the instructions require. You build the object. You send the object. The sending closes the loop. And the loop had been closed, from the object's perspective, from the beginning. The question of when to build it, she was getting better at catching this framework error, this gravitational pull of the temporal narrative. The question of where in the causal chain the construction would occur was not hers to answer yet. Possibly not hers to answer at all. She was in the early part of the project, the part that was largely decoding and understanding. The technology development would take time. Could take a century. Could take more. The loop was patient. The loop had always been patient. The loop had been sitting in the granite for 500 million years. What she was less certain about, and what she thought about often in the quiet hours, in the particular quality of attention she had begun to cultivate, which was less like focus and more like listening, was something that had begun as a small dissonance and had grown, slowly, into something that felt important. The instructions described how to build the object. She was confident of that. But as the decoding progressed and more of the text became legible, she had begun to notice something in its structure. A pattern she had not anticipated. The instructions were not static. They were responsive. The document on the server continued to receive new text at irregular intervals, even now, 8 months after the initial appearances. The new text was always in response to their most recent research. Not summarizing it, they had established that, Park was certain, but responding to it. Reacting. Adjusting. The instructions were being updated. By something that knew what they were learning. By something that was tracking the progress of their understanding in real time. She had thought, in the early weeks, that the text was a record. A chronicle of their work, written from some future point and transmitted backward. But it wasn't a record. It was a correspondence. They were receiving transmissions from a point in the causal loop that was future to them, and that point was updating the instructions as their capacity to understand and eventually execute them developed. Someone, or something, was watching their progress and revising the plan accordingly. Someone was in the loop with them. She sat with this for a long time. She thought about the figure in Okonkwo's photograph. The tall person in slightly unfamiliar clothes, photographed in the surface of the object, standing in a posture that looked less like discovery and more like, what? Review. The posture of someone checking on something. Someone who already knew what they were looking at. She thought about the grass. The grass growing back. Not slowly, the way grass grows. Immediately, or rather, in the time between the satellite image and her arrival. As if the meadow was restoring itself to a prior state, correcting a deviation, maintaining some template. As if something was managing the site. Keeping it ready. Keeping it as it needed to be for the next part of the sequence. She thought about the word managed and what it implied. She thought about what it would mean to be inside a closed causal loop that was also being supervised. That had, somewhere in its structure, an awareness that could observe all points in the loop from some position she couldn't locate. Not outside the loop. She was fairly confident nothing was outside the loop. But through it, the way you can travel a circle and pass through every point on its circumference. She thought about the object sitting in its chamber, patient in its ancient dark, emitting its quiet quantum signals, receiving her team's work and sending revised instructions, as it had always been doing, as it would always be doing, in the continuous present of its atemporal existence. She thought, am I also in the instructions? The thought was not frightening. Or it was frightening, and she had developed a relationship with that kind of fear that made it navigable. The thought was, more than anything, interesting. In the deep sense of the word, the sense that Park used it in, the sense that meant here is a place where the map has edges and beyond the edges something real continues. If she was in the instructions, then her progress was expected. Her discoveries were expected. Her second paper was expected. The technology that the field would develop in response to the framework was expected. The eventual construction of the object was expected, by whoever, had updated those instructions in response to her work. Not predetermined. She was careful about that word. The loop didn't predetermine anything. The loop sustained itself through the decisions and actions of everyone inside it, just as a living organism sustains itself through chemistry that is not predetermined but is, nonetheless, the organism. She was an element of the loop's metabolism. Her curiosity, her rigor, her late-night solitude in a dark office, these were not trapped behaviors. They were the behaviors of a person who was genuinely curious and genuinely rigorous, making genuine choices, and those choices were consistent with the loop because she was the kind of person who would always make them. The loop did not constrain her. It was made of her. This was the thing she couldn't quite finish thinking. She kept coming back to it in different forms. The loop was made of the choices of everyone in it. Every researcher who had decoded a page of the text. Every engineer who would eventually develop the necessary technology. Every administrator who had approved funding, every politician who had signed the international agreement, every child who would grow up in a world where the object was known and would become a physicist because of it, all of them were the loop. All of them were, in the precise sense, both the cause and the effect of what the object was. There was no external creator. No civilization that had decided to send a message and chosen their particular planet to receive it. The object was not a gift from an advanced species. The object was what humanity, in some future form, at some future level of understanding, would make of itself. The loop was humanity's own causal shadow, cast backward across time and discovered by the very species that would eventually cast it. They were the aliens. They had always been the aliens. She wrote this in her notebook, her physical, spiral-bound notebook, on a page that was blank, that she was filling in the present, with her own hand, with ink that would dry and remain on the page going forward through time in the ordinary direction. And then she looked at the pages that had been there when she first noticed the notebook had been altered. The future-dated pages. The analyses and conclusions written in her own handwriting before she had made them. She found the one she was looking for. Dated 6 weeks from now. The last entry on the last future-dated page. She had read it many times in the past 8 months. She read it again now. It said, "The question is not where the loop comes from. The question is what we do inside it." She had not written this. She would write it, 6 weeks from now, which was the same thing. She looked at it for a long time. She thought, yes. That is the right question. Not the cause, not the origin, not the architecture. The choices. The actions. The quality of attention that a person brings to the extraordinary fact of being alive inside a universe that turns out to be stranger and more intricate and more full of possibility than anyone had been capable of imagining before she walked into that chamber and sat down in front of something that had been waiting for her since before the Earth existed. Waiting. She had used that word. Waiting implied a beginning of the waiting. It implied a point before which the waiting had not yet begun. But the object had no such point. The object had been in the granite from before the granite existed, in a loop that enclosed all the moments of its own creation, in a structure that made the question of before and after grammatically questionable, like asking how the edge of the universe feels from the outside. The object was not waiting. The object simply was. And this, she decided, sitting alone in her office, water glass empty, pen in hand, the city moving outside, the universe proceeding in every direction simultaneously through the self-sustaining loop of its own causal consequence, this was perhaps the most profound thing she had learned. Not the technology she would help to develop. Not the framework she had published. Not the future she was, in some structural sense, already inside. The most profound thing was the quality of the object's being. The absolute, patient, non-waiting presence of a thing that existed outside the question of time. That simply occupied its place in causal space with complete sufficiency. That needed no before and no after and no outside and no origin. That was the record of its own existence. She thought, I want to understand that. Not the physics of it. She was already understanding the physics, or beginning to. She wanted to understand it existentially. What it felt like, if feeling was a meaningful concept, to exist without contingency. To be a thing whose existence was entirely self-sufficient. To be proof of yourself. She thought, perhaps that is what the object is trying to teach us. Not technology. Not physics. Not the mechanics of causal loops, though it taught those too. Perhaps the object, the made thing, the self-caused artifact, the universe's note to itself, was teaching a different lesson. About existence. About the difference between a thing that needs a reason and a thing that is its own reason. She put down her pen. She looked out the window at the city, at the sky above it, at the dark beyond the sky, at the unimaginable depth of space through which she had spent her career trying to see. The universe was 12 billion light-years in every direction, and it had been doing whatever it was doing for 14 billion years, and she was a human being sitting in an office in Istanbul thinking about it, which was either the most improbable thing imaginable or the most inevitable, depending on your framework. She thought about the object sitting in the mountain. She thought, we haven't found it yet. Not in the recursive, causal loop sense. In the ordinary sense. In the sense of understanding. They had located it and measured it and decoded a portion of its language and derived a framework from its existence that had already begun to reshape multiple fields of inquiry. But they had not found it yet. The finding would take generations. The finding was the loop itself, the long process of understanding that would eventually produce the civilization sophisticated enough to construct the object and send it, which would complete the loop, which would mean that the object had always been there to be found. The finding was not a moment. The finding was a civilization's entire relationship with an idea. She picked up her pen again. On a clean page, at the top, she wrote a date 6 weeks in the future. And then she began to write what she knew she would write, because she was the kind of person who would write it, because the loop was made of the choices of the people inside it, and her choice was always the same, to keep looking. To keep asking. To carry the question forward into the space where the question was the only thing that made sense, where cause and effect were like two people telling the same story from different ends, where the beginning was the end was the beginning, and the only honest response to this was not awe or terror but the particular, difficult, luminous feeling of someone who has stood at the edge of the map and seen that beyond the edge, the world continues. The world continues. She wrote, the question is not where the loop comes from. She paused. She wrote, the question is what we do inside it. She capped her pen. She looked at what she had written. It looked right. It felt true. It was something she had always been going to write, and it was something she had chosen to write, and these two things were the same. Outside, the city hummed its electrical hum. In a mountain range she couldn't see from here, 40 meters beneath a meadow where the grass grew green and seamless as if nothing had ever disturbed it, an object older than the earth sat in its chamber in its patient, atemporal dark, precisely as it had always been, precisely as it would always be, waiting for a moment that had already passed and had not yet come, being what it was in the only way available to a thing that exists outside the question of time. Completely.